Great, thanks, Megan. Uh, yeah, welcome everybody. Just echo Megan's thanks in joining us for the webinar this afternoon. Glad to have you on board for about the next hour or so to talk about how to go for gold with your LIMS and CDS validation. So a little bit about myself, who you're listening to. As mentioned, my name is John Zank. I am the Director of Validation, Software Validation and Strategic Services at CSOLS. I've been with CSOLS for about 7.5 years now, but my career has spanned 22 years of computer system validation in the FDA-regulated industries. So large pharma, CROs, vaccines, small pharma, GXP, R&D, kind of a little bit of everything along the way. I also have experience with implementing laboratory and enterprise systems, single site, multi-site, and working with ITIS groups to qualify infrastructure and networks, perform multiple laboratory system and data integrity audits along the way as well. All right, so we'll jump into the agenda. The topic is going for gold. What I'm a fan of the Olympics. I know we just had the Summer Olympics, and it occurred to me, some of my favorite events in the Olympics are track and field. So it got me thinking about how could I tie some of that in to software validation, because I'm always up for a challenge or something like along those lines. So I looked at hurdling, and what I'd like to do, the approach I take in this presentation is to tie that into hurdling. Now, I myself, I'm not a hurdler, but like I said, a fan of track and field, and know a little bit about the different sports. So hopefully you'll be able to follow some of the analogies there as we move through the different hurdles that you'll encounter as you're going for gold. So I'll talk a little bit about determining your technique, then get into the actual hurdles that you encounter, assembling your team, overcoming false starts, what stutter stepping is, looking at the lead leg and the trail leg when it comes to clearing your hurdles, and then we'll finally get to the summary at the finish line. All right, so we'll start with determining your technique. And this applies to just about anything that you're setting out to do, whether it is track and field, hurdling, software validation, you name it. There's a technique out there available, and so when we're looking at validating a LIMS or CDS, and your technique there, it's really coming down to what your approach is to software validation. And so again, when I was putting this together, I kind of looked at three main areas of approaches to validation that we encounter with our clients and customers. And so there's three big areas, I would say. There's a one-size-fits-all approach to validation, which is no matter what the system is, your company may just follow that same approach. Right, so big, small, complex, simple, you kind of have a one-size-fits-all. So hopefully as we talk through the hurdles, you'll see where some of those you may be able to overcome those if you're doing a one-size-fits-all. There's the approach of, well, we just use the vendor documentation to consider our system, our LIMS or our CDS validated. And as we walk through, one of the things hopefully you'll see is that there's a lot more than just the vendor documentation. But again, if that's what you're using, I do have some ways to clear some of the hurdles you'll encounter with that. And then there's another big approach is, well, we're validating the system while we use it, right? It's not really the best recommended approach, but we do know that there are circumstances where you just can't avoid that, or for one reason or another, you need the system in place, you have to get it up and running, but at the same time, you're going to validate. So we'll talk about some of the hurdles you may encounter there, right? And the other thing to keep in mind when you're trying to determine your technique for how you're going to validate a LIMS or a CDS, within the event of hurdling, there's in between the hurdles, the racers have to determine whether it's a 3-step or a 15-step approach, right? You have to gauge that and know what that approach is going to be so you're not running into the hurdles the whole way down or tripping over them. So when we're looking at validation of a LIMS or CDS, that 3-step or 15-step could be best looked at as how big of an implementation are you going to do? How much configuration is involved? And we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. But the recommendation that we have at this point, and what we follow also at CSOLs when we do validations for our customers, is following the GAMP system classifications. If you're not familiar with GAMP, it's good automated manufacturing practices. And although it does say manufacturing practices, it is widely seen as acceptable across the GXP environment. So anywhere you're doing a LIMS, CDS informatics system, I would say if you don't have it, try to get a copy, reference GAMP. That will help kind of narrow down and give you a little bit more direction on the size of your validation and what's required. Take time to understand the full impact of your system, right? And what I mean by that is if you're implementing a LIMS and let's just say it's your first implementation of a LIMS and you're going from paper to electronic, it's understanding, it's more than just saying we're going to get the system, install it and start using it. Take time to understand, well, what does that mean? How's it going to impact all the other groups? And what groups are going to be impacted so you can bring them into discussion? Kind of understand that landscape so you know who to involve. And we'll get to that hurdle of assembling your team on the next slide. If you can, get a demo of the system from the vendor. Maybe you've already done this, you've gone through a system selection process and you've seen what the system can do, so you're a little familiar with it, or you're in the situation where you have a LIMS or a chromatography system now and you're going to either a new version or a different vendor that provides it, so you have some familiarity. In any of those events, it's still good to get a demo or a test environment of the system so that you can understand what you're going to implement, right? And then if you have existing processes, if you've done software validation with other systems and you have processes that you can leverage, try to figure out what those are, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on several slides down when we talk about documentation and specifically the processes that you could use, right? So let's say you've determined your technique. You have in mind now whether, if this is a 3-step, a short kind of engagement, a 15-step, it's very involved implementation, brand new system, lots of requirements, lots of functionality, right? So you have a good feel for what that looks like. The first hurdle then that you might run into is assembling your team.